Lyn Alden is another Bitcoin proponent that I respect. Like Michael Saylor, she has a background in engineering. She is the founder of Lyn Alden Investment Strategy. She has just put out a new book titled Broken Money that is currently available on Amazon and will soon be available on other platforms. Lyn is a macro investor and has a huge following on Twitter. She was interviewed by Sam Callahan on the Swan Bitcoin YouTube channel. First clip. Sam asks her about a tweet where she said the asset she's most interested in for the next decade is Bitcoin.
Bitcoin's off to a good start this year. But you sent out a tweet and you said, I don't know what it will do over the next year, but the asset I am most interested over the next decade remains Bitcoin. And so when you're looking out maybe 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, you're still pretty bullish on Bitcoin. And I just wanted to hear, Lyn Alden's bullish take for Bitcoin. Like why do you think it's so interesting? And when you look out and you put it against this entire macroeconomic backdrop, why Bitcoin?
So I think ultimately it solves a lot of problems with money. I mean, one of the things I've been working on over the past year is a book on money, and it's really a book about the technology of money over time. And a big problem that humanity has had for like literally a century and a half is that we figured out how to speed up our transactions. So ever since we invented the telegraph and then started laying the cables under bodies of water. So the UK and France were connected in like the 1850s. And then by the late 1860s, you got United States and Europe, cross-Atlantic cables. And then from there, we got it across the Pacific. And so you could send information. That was the first time we could send information really at the speed of light. Prior to that, information had to move at the speed of people. Whereas now we could send information, within seconds and minutes. And so we could update ledgers around the world, instantaneously. And of course, we added the telephone, we added the internet, e-commerce, all that. Whereas settlements were still slow. And so even during the classical gold standard, which is known as a good period of monetary history, it was ultimately unstable. There were way more gold IOUs trading rapidly around there compared to the amount of gold in the system, in large part because of how efficient transactions and netting were compared to the underlying metal. Um, and then you had the Bretton Woods system that broke. It's often talked about how it was formed in 1944, but that was just the conference. It didn't really go into full effect until like 1958, and then within like 13 years it broke.
Yeah.
It's like basically all these ways, all these like bad systems to try to close that gap between transactions and settlements. And so what I think Bitcoin represents is the first time where you have settlements that move at the speed of light or almost the speed of light. And so that's the first time where that fundamental mismatch is solved. Um, and it's now, it's been a while. I mean, at first when I saw Bitcoin, like, more than a decade ago, I was like, that's neat, but, who knows? I don't know if that was going to be the winner. I don't know what this market's going to look like. But as Bitcoin has proved itself, as it's been shown to be truly decentralized, as it's gotten through various conflicts, and as it's retained so much market share, I think it's increasingly clear that just Bitcoin is a key solution to money. And the world's been stuck in this like local maximum, right? So obviously, the invention of telecommunication systems is a good thing, but it did leave us with a situation where gold and silver are not effective money. Central banks have a monopoly on practically on money. There's 160 different fiat currencies approximately, and each one is like a monopoly in its own area. But then, other than the top, say, five, there's very limited salability anywhere else in the world for that country's currency. I have Egyptian pounds in the drawer next to me, and good. I like around here in New Jersey. Like, good luck for me trying to like have someone take them off my hands for me. I have Norwegian currency, which is obviously a stronger currency, but even there, the salability is terrible here. It's,
Yeah.
it's really only dollars and euros and a couple others that have any sort of reasonable salability outside of their own countries. And so we've been kind of stuck in this like barter system, with the invention of fiat currencies, and gold and silver have just been too slow to ever reassert themselves and say, hey, here's we don't have to use these crappy currencies. We can use gold and silver. The problem is they're just too slow. And so I'm bullish on Bitcoin because I think it does truly solve the problem. It's held up against all sorts of different macro environments, all sorts of different technical challenges. Um, and there's so much building on it happening, right? They say building happens in bear markets. And I've been watching that closely. I mean, I'm involved somewhat in venture, so I get to see what founders are building, and it's just super exciting. I mean, one of the things I'm most excited about is the stuff going on with Fedi and Fediment,
Yeah.
and that whole ecosystem. But just beyond that, there's just so many things that are being built, and I think that the world's just not ready for it yet. And I think that that'll materialize in the years ahead. And of course, any given 6 month period, Bitcoin's price is going to be tied to liquidity. So a handful of choices between Yellen and Powell and a few others can probably move the price pretty substantially. So I don't really try to make 6 month predictions, but I think the floor is probably in, and I think we're headed higher in the years ahead.
Sam then brings up how small Bitcoin's market cap is in the big picture. Lyn gives her take on the institutional interest that there is currently and how that will play out in the coming years. She also gives her opinion on the probability and possible impact of a spot Bitcoin ETF. Enjoy the clip.
Interesting things about Bitcoin is that it's such a tiny asset. I mean, when you look at it in the grand scheme of things, compared to other asset classes, it's so small, which means there's a lot of opportunity. And this past week, we saw a lot of institutional interests. We had the BlackRock filing a couple of weeks ago. We had large European banks come in and try to get custody of digital assets, like apply to licenses and things like that. So how do you what's your take about that? Because we had about 26 trillion of assets under management with all these institutions who all had kind of bullish developments when it comes to Bitcoin. Seems like they're entering the fray finally, maybe capitulating that Bitcoin is here to stay. What's your overall take about these ETFs as well as those other developments?
Yeah, so I mean, there's depending on what measurement you use, there's hundreds of trillions of dollars of global assets, and Bitcoin is hundreds of billions. So it's a fraction of 1%. Um, and when you look at the total addressable market of Bitcoin, there's obviously a big range. It's hard to say exactly what that market is, but it's not far-fetched to say most entities would want to have some handful percentage of their assets in this portable, finite, self-custodial asset, liquid. Um, and so another bullish thing about it is that in some ways, certain entities can't even adopt it until it gets bigger, right? So when daily trading volume was in the millions, a billionaire would have trouble getting in and out of it without moving the price. There's just not enough liquidity for them to comfortably uh, enter and exit it in size, other than just dabbling. Similar today, there's billions of dollars of liquidity, but a $1 trillion pool of capital has to be careful about moving the market, how much they can enter or exit, and things like that. And so I think as you see more and more, I don't like the word regulatory clarity, but it comes up a lot. I mean, basically, once they see, okay, Bitcoin is different than some of the other assets, um, the government's not going to ban it, or it'd be silly if they did. You start to see different pools of capital to say, okay, it's normal to have a non-zero amount in this asset. So 6 years ago, BlackRock called it like an index for money laundering, and now they're filing ETF to hold it, right? So they've done a complete U-turn um, on how they perceive the asset, um, largely due to market demand, ongoing adoption, ongoing education about the space. I think to some extent, it's I I would always like to see, like, I'm always more interested in developing country adoption of Bitcoin
Sure.
more than I am like Wall Street adoption. But to the extent that the network continues to be successful, large pools of capital entering it are inevitable. And they do add liquidity to the overall ecosystem and overall market size. They benefit miners, they benefit users. So it is a positive development, in my opinion. But of course, I'd be more bullish to see a thousand different Fediments pop up, and
Mm,
people around the world custody it in their countries, rather than see these big honeypots form. But I think
totally.
that I'd have to agree with that phrase, like everything's good for Bitcoin. I generally would like phrase it a little bit differently, which is most things are good for Bitcoin, and institutional adoption is one of them. So to the extent that there is a spot ETF, I think that'd be beneficial. Right now, you've had all sorts of entities have had to use inferior products. Um, and I think a spot ETF would clean up the market a little bit, at least for American users. Other countries already have, ironically, spot ETFs. It's not really been an issue. So I think we're just seeing another wave of adoption. And I think probably when we look back, 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now, it'll seem obvious. Like, well, of course, there's of course having a Bitcoin in your portfolio as some slice makes sense, even for kind of like normie finance.
What do you think specifically about this ETF? I mean, in Bitcoin, we've been talking about a spot Bitcoin ETF every year. It seems like it's right around the corner. SEC rejects it for one reason or another. But this time it's BlackRock, and so people are excited about it again. But what do you see as the probabilities that they're actually going to allow this thing to go through? And then maybe what are some of the pros and cons of having a spot Bitcoin ETF in your opinion?
Yeah, so I think the next bull market's going to happen regardless of whether or not there's a spot ETF. This kind of thing I think can just influence the timing and the magnitude of it, because it allows potentially new pools of capital to enter that would otherwise, have to enter slower or, in other ways. So in general, I think it would be constructive for price. Um, and as to the odds, I try not to guess these odds. I think we are getting closer. I think that the more iteration you see, especially from these larger entities like BlackRock and Fidelity, it increases the odds, of one eventually being approved, because these filings are not just identical filings from years ago. The SEC always gives their reasons for, why they turn them down. Whether or not they're valid is another story, but they say, okay, here's the reasons why we turned it down. And so then these filings come along and say, okay, we've addressed the reasons that you've turned the other ones down. And then they can say, well, it's still not quite. So they, okay, that's fine. We iterated again. We went and made it even more specific, right? So it's eventually, kind of the SEC gets stuck in a corner where it's like you answered everything they said to do, and they either have to say we don't like Bitcoin, we're not going to approve one, or they just have to, capitulate and start allowing a couple spot Bitcoin ETFs to form. I think one of the funny things is they allowed a leveraged Bitcoin futures ETF, which is clearly a less safe product than a spot Bitcoin ETF. And so it's really hard to be in that environment where you're just always holding back a spot ETF, but you're willing to do a leveraged futures ETF. Um, as for how it's good or bad, I mean, I think, I would not want to see a particularly large percentage of Bitcoin, uh, held by, BlackRock and Coinbase and, large entities. Um, Generally, the biggest problem that gold faced is because gold was slow. Gold got centralized and abstracted, and allowed for all sorts of claims to be built on top of it. And those claims were not tested very frequently because most people didn't want to withdraw their gold. They liked having access to the liquidity, of a globally interconnected ledger, for lack of a better word. Um, Whereas with Bitcoin, I think the main thing is that it's really easy to test, um, whether or not someone has the Bitcoin they say they do, making sure there's not a lot of IOUs being built on top of it, um, at least relative to the size of the overall market. And so, I think it's better if people self custody or do collaborative custody or do, local custody, like let's say Fedimints, things like that. There's a spectrum that people can do rather than these big giant honeypots of, like one entity holding millions of people's Bitcoin. But I think that at this stage of adoption, people do want to have it in their brokerage account. They want to have a slice of Bitcoin in a diversified portfolio. And I think to the extent that there are a handful of different ETFs out there, that's good for them. If someone would not buy Bitcoin otherwise, or if, the majority of their capital is in their 401k or in their IRA, and they want to have, some X% of Bitcoin in there, and that's the majority of their capital. The fact that there's a spot ETF, I think, is a good thing. But in general, it's always going to be an inferior product to the real thing, because the real thing, you can self custody it, you can bring around the entire world with you, you can tip people on Nostr with it, you can do whatever you want to do with it. Whereas when you have it in that ETF form, it's only really good for price. It's more just like strictly an investment, which is a good starting point. But it's just different pools of capital, different products for different pools of capital.